The air tasted of cold dust and rain that hadn't yet fallen. On a Thursday afternoon in September 1945, a freight car packed with 47 German women, pulled from the ruins of the Wehrmacht's Auxiliary Corps, sat on a railway siding 2 miles west of Ashford, Kent. They stepped down onto gravel slick with oil, blinking against the pale light like prisoners surfacing from a mine. Their uniforms, once pressed and functional, hung loose on frames hollowed by weeks of near starvation in American transit camps. Their hair was matted, their skin gray, their eyes had learned to expect nothing. A British sergeant stood waiting, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 younger soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave. He watched them stumble into a rough formation. One woman swayed and nearly fell. The sergeant stepped forward, steadied her with a hand under her elbow, and said something quiet in halting German. Then he nodded to the younger soldiers. They moved down the line, handing out tin mugs filled with tea, hot, milky, with real sugar dissolved at the bottom. The women stared at the mugs as though they might vanish. Some drank immediately, scalding their tongues. Others held the warmth between their palms and wept without sound. The sergeant returned to his clipboard, his voice flat and procedural. Processing at the camp, medical exam first, no rough treatment. You are prisoners of war under British custody. That means something here. He paused, glanced at the women, then added in slow, careful German. You will be fed. One of the prisoners, a young woman with hollow cheeks and wheat-colored hair named Elsa Hartmann, looked up at him. Her lips moved as though testing words she no longer trusted. The sergeant met her gaze for half a second, then turned and walked toward the waiting trucks. Behind him, the women climbed aboard, clutching their tin mugs like talismans. Civilization, it turned out, sometimes announced itself in whispers. The women on that train had carried certain beliefs with them across the shattered map of Europe. Beliefs fed to them in cramped barracks and printed in newspapers that no longer existed. They had been told that capture by the British meant brutality, starvation, forced labor until collapse. That enemy soldiers would strip them of dignity before stripping them of life. That women in uniform would be treated with particular cruelty, revenge for the Blitz, retribution for years of war. Some had heard worse whispers of Soviet camps where prisoners froze or starved by the thousands, stories of American transit stations where rations disappeared and chaos reigned. The propaganda had been clear. The Allies were monsters in different uniforms. Surrender meant trading one death for another. So when they stepped off that train in Kent, stomachs knotted with hunger and fear, they expected the worst. They expected shouting, blows, to be sorted like livestock and forgotten. What they received instead was a tin mug of tea. And that small, impossible gesture cracked the foundation of everything they thought they knew. The camp itself was a series of low wooden huts surrounded by wire that looked more administrative than punishing. Guards patrolled without the tension they had braced for. No dogs, no shouting, just the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel. Processing took place in a converted barn. An older officer with tired eyes asked questions through an interpreter. Name, rank, unit. He made notes, stamped a form, and waved them toward a door marked medical. Inside, a British Army nurse, middle-aged and efficient, examined Elsa with brisk competence. When she pressed fingers against Elsa's ribs and felt bone too close to skin, her mouth tightened. She said something to an orderly, who returned with a biscuit and a small tin of condensed milk. The nurse mixed it with hot water and handed it to Elsa. Drink slowly, she said in accented but clear German. Your stomach will rebel if you rush. Elsa stared at the cup, the sweetness making her throat ache. The tin mug of tea had been the first crack. This was the second. That night, in a hut with proper bunks and clean blankets, Elsa lay awake. She thought about the nurse's hands, steady, professional, unmarked by cruelty. She thought about the tea, the biscuit, the way the sergeant had steadied the woman who stumbled. She thought about propaganda, and for the first time, she wondered what else had been a lie. What Elsa could not have known was that her treatment was not an accident. It was policy. Britain's approach to prisoners of war was built on 4 pillars, each reinforced by tradition and hardened by pragmatism. First, security. Prisoners behind wire could not fight. Humane treatment reduced escape attempts and unrest. A well-fed, fairly treated POW was easier to guard than a desperate one. Second, intelligence. Prisoners who felt respected were more likely to cooperate. Interrogations without torture yielded better information. Trust, even fragile trust, opened doors that brutality sealed shut. Third, diplomacy and reciprocity. Britain held German POWs. Germany held British POWs. The Geneva Conventions created a web of mutual obligation. Treat prisoners well, and your own soldiers stood a better chance of decent treatment abroad. It was insurance written in policy. Fourth, morality. Britain had fought this war in part to defend civilization against barbarism. To torture or starve prisoners would be to become the enemy. The Royal Army operated under the belief that victory without principle was hollow. This was not sentimental kindness. It was restraint. Civilization under pressure, choosing order over revenge, even when revenge would have been easy. The British understood something fundamental: cruelty is a choice, and they chose otherwise. The first meal came that evening, served in a mess hut that smelled of boiled potatoes and institutional disinfectant. The women lined up with tin plates. A British cook, sleeves rolled to his elbows, spooned out portions without comment: mashed potatoes, tinned peas, a slice of spam glistening with fat. Bread, thick and pale, with a scraping of margarine. It was plain food, ration food. But it was hot and real, and it was more than most had seen in weeks. Elsa sat at a long wooden table and ate with trembling hands. Across from her, a dark-haired woman named Gisela wept quietly into her potatoes. Others ate in silence, chewing slowly, as though afraid the meal might be snatched away. One woman laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that broke off into a sob. The guards stood along the walls, watching but not interfering. One of them, a young private with red hair and freckles named Collins, shifted uncomfortably, then looked away. Later, a British officer stood and read from a typed sheet. Rules simple, direct. No unauthorized movement. Work assignments would begin. Letters could be written and would be censored but delivered. Medical concerns were to be reported. Refusal to cooperate would result in loss of privileges, not physical punishment. You are prisoners, the officer said in clear, slow German. But you are not animals. Behave accordingly, and you will be treated accordingly. He folded the paper and left. That small thing to say, such a low bar to clear. Yet, after everything, it felt like a revolution. Within a week, the women were assigned to work details, not as punishment, but as policy. The Geneva Conventions permitted POW labor, provided it was non-military and humane. Britain, desperate for agricultural labor, saw an opportunity. The prisoners saw a chance to earn small wages and escape the boredom of the huts. Elsa was sent to a dairy farm 3 miles from the camp with a dozen others. The farm belonged to a man named Whitmore, weathered as old leather, who ran the place with his wife and a teenage son. He stood in the yard that first morning, arms crossed. "You'll milk," he said through an interpreter. "Morning and evening. You break something, you fix it. You steal, you're gone. You work honest, you'll eat honest. Simple as that." The work was hard. Dawn milking began at 5 a.m., fingers aching in the cold. But the rhythm was soothing. No radios crackling with bad news, no bombs, just the hiss of milk into pails. By the second week, Whitmore's wife began leaving a pot of tea and thick slices of bread on the workbench. She said nothing, just set it down and walked away. By the third week, Elsa could milk a cow faster than Whitmore's son. The work became routine, then competence, then, quietly, a source of pride. One afternoon, Whitmore took a heavy pail from Elsa and carried it for her. "Good work," he said in slow English. It was the currency of respect, built one pail at a time. Not all the locals were as pragmatic as Whitmore. Some refused to acknowledge the prisoners, turning away when the trucks passed. Others glared with a bitterness that needed no translation. The war had cost Britain dearly. Families had lost sons, brothers, fathers. Cities had burned. Resentment was a resource that never ran out. but proximity has a way of eroding certainty. Mrs. Whitmore, who had said nothing for the first month, began to speak in clipped, functional sentences. "Mind the gate. Don't leave tools in the rain." Later, when a young woman named Annalise caught a fever, Mrs. Whitmore brought her a bowl of soup herself, set it down on the bunk, and left without a word. The next day, Annalise returned to work. By winter, small shifts had accumulated into something larger. Elsa was allowed to walk unescorted from the barn to the house to fetch supplies. The teenage son, who had once glared, now joked in broken German about the cows. And on Christmas Eve, as the women prepared to leave, Whitmore pressed a small parcel into Elsa's hands. Inside was a knitted wool scarf, worn but clean. "Wife's," he said gruffly. "Don't need it now." Elsa clutched the scarf as the truck rattled away. That night, she wore it in the hut. The women said nothing, but their silence was not empty. It was the silence of people reconsidering the map of the world they had been handed. In late October, a woman named Margot developed a persistent cough that turned bloody. The camp's medical officer, a Scottish doctor named MacLeod, examined her and diagnosed tuberculosis. Within hours, she was transferred to a civilian hospital in Canterbury. The women watched her go with rising fear. Hospitals were where people disappeared. But 3 weeks later, Margot returned. Thinner but alive. She spoke in a dazed voice about clean sheets, medicine that worked, and a British nurse who had sat with her during the worst night, reading aloud from a book Margot couldn't understand but found comforting anyway. "They treated me," Margot said, still disbelieving, "like I was a person." Dr. MacLeod visited the camp weekly, checking on chronic ailments and dispensing treatment with the same brisk efficiency he would have used on British soldiers. He did not smile often, but he did not sneer either. When Elsa asked him once why he bothered, he looked at her as though the question was absurd. "You're ill," he said simply. "I'm a doctor." It was a statement so plain it felt radical. His actions, repeated week after week, carved out a truth the women could not ignore. The enemy they had been taught to fear was capable of restraint. And restraint, they were learning, was its own form of power. Trust was not given in declarations. It was built in gestures so small they barely registered until you looked back and realized the ground had shifted beneath you. After a brutal shift where a cow kicked over a full pail, Elsa sat on her bunk and thought about the last year. The mud, the hunger, the American camps, the sergeant with the tea, the nurse, Whitmore's "Good work," the scarf. None of it fit the story she had been told. The propaganda had painted a world of monolithic hatred, where the enemy was a faceless beast. But here, the enemy had a face. It was the tired face of Sergeant Evans on the platform. It was the efficient face of the army nurse. It was the gruff face of Farmer Whitmore and the kind, weary face of Dr. MacLeod. It was even the embarrassed face of Private Collins offering a cigarette. These were not monsters. They were people making choices. And the choice they consistently made was for order, for procedure, for a quiet, undramatic decency. This was not the fiery, emotional kindness of friendship. It was the cool, reliable architecture of a system that refused to break, even for its enemies. It was a strength she had not been taught to recognize. The British were not being kind, they were being civilized. And in the wreckage of a world torn apart by barbarism, that was a far more powerful thing. Christmas came with frost that turned the camp's wire into silver lace. The women had not expected to celebrate. Prisoners did not get holidays. But the British, it seemed, operated differently. On Christmas Eve, the camp commandant, a soft-spoken Major Henshaw, announced the service would be held in the mess hut. Attendance was optional. A German-speaking chaplain had been arranged. Elsa went along with most of the others. The hut had been decorated sparsely with a small pine tree, paper garlands, and candles. The chaplain read from the Gospel of Luke in careful German. The women sang softly, voices cracking on the high notes. When the service ended, the guards brought in trays, biscuits, chocolate, tinned fruit, small luxuries hoarded from rations. They set them on the tables without ceremony and stepped back. Major Henshaw cleared his throat. "Happy Christmas," he said in accented German. Then, in English to his men, "At ease." The guards relaxed. Private Collins approached Elsa hesitantly and offered her a cigarette. She shook her head but thanked him. He nodded, embarrassed, and retreated. Later, back in the hut, Elsa looked at the small piece of chocolate she had saved. It was not just a treat. It was a symbol of a world that could, at times, choose grace over vengeance. It was proof that the light had not gone out. The war in Europe had been over for months, but its end was not a single moment. It was a slow, patient process of rebuilding, both of brick and of spirit. For Elsa and the others, that process was a daily recalibration. Each meal that arrived without threat, each order given without a shout, each small gesture from a guard or a farmer was another stitch mending the torn fabric of their reality. They had been given a map of the world drawn in hatred and fear. But here, in the quiet fields of Kent, they were redrawing it themselves, based on the evidence before them. The evidence of a tin mug, a doctor's duty, a scarf given without expectation. They were learning that the most profound truths are often found not in grand ideologies, but in the quiet, consistent practice of humanity. One afternoon in early spring, Elsa was walking back from the barn, the scarf from Mrs. Whitmore around her neck. She saw Private Collins on guard duty. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The war was over. Here, in this corner of England, a fragile, quiet peace was taking root. It was not the peace of treaties or victory parades. It was the peace that comes when people, on both sides of the wire, remember their shared humanity. And in the end, that was the only peace that could ever truly last.